Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us today for Interact. I'm Connor, one of your Dev Interrupted community leaders. And today I've got with me Henrik Gütle with me for our lightning talk about Microsoft's research into developer velocity. Henrik is the general manager of Microsoft Azure. He's responsible for leading the commercial cloud business for Microsoft Canada. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Connor. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm super stoked to have you as part of Interact. This new research is really exciting. Can you summarize the big takeaways from Microsoft's research into developer velocity for everyone here?
Sure, I can at least try, because the whole developer velocity research actually spanned two different parts and two different surveys that we had in the market. So let me just spend a couple of minutes kind of level setting on
That'd be perfect.
the findings we got in both. I think that the first survey we put into market happened early 2012, so pre-COVID, and we were researching just over 400 large companies around the world, and we were really trying to quantify like what business impact does developer velocity have, and at the same time getting a bit more crisp on what are some of the drivers behind developer velocity that have the biggest business impact. And as you could expect, like the survey found that there was a direct correlation between high developer velocity and business impact. Like companies in the top quartile had,
you know that now.
Exactly, 4 to 5 times higher profit margin, more innovative, and so forth. But what I thought was really interesting out of that first part of the survey was the drivers that make up the biggest impact, or the drivers that have the biggest impact. Because we looked at developer velocity across over 40 dimensions, and there were really 4 things that bubbled up to the surface. Like one was the importance of strong product management capabilities inside the organization. The second one was around culture. The third one was around developer tools and developer tool sets. And the last one was around talent management. So out of all the 40 dimensions we looked at, these were by far the 4 most impactful as it pertains to driving high developer velocity.
And then fast forward to the second piece, what were the kind of outcomes you found there?
Yeah, so then in early 2021, late 2020, early 21, we ran a second version of the survey just to validate our findings, but also to take a closer look at like did COVID and this whole shift to remote work actually have any impact on some of the findings. And in general, it was a very similar theme or very similar feedback we got. In this survey, we particularly looked at actually retail and financial service customers, in particular the developer organizations inside those companies, because they were 2 industries that were pretty much on the front line as it pertains to the whole transformation.
Right.
And findings were similar to as in the first survey, and in general they fell into one of 3 categories. There was a category around technology, there was a category around working practices, and there was a category around organizational enablement. And on the technology side, a couple of things that stood out. I think number one, and shouldn't be a surprise to you or any of your listeners, I think cloud adoption was obviously one of the things that set the digital leaders apart from some of that and some of the laggards. But also having investments in solid tool sets and tool changes. And that actually came across in 2 regards. I mean, number one, this whole shift to remote work all of a sudden. Like companies who had made investments in sophisticated and advanced developer tools that had unified developer tools across the organization actually saw a parity in developer productivity between remote developer productivity and in-person developer productivity. So for many of these digital leaders, the shift to remote work actually did not impact developer productivity, and we actually saw the same at Microsoft. Whereas those who were laggards obviously saw a decrease in developer productivity, but even more importantly, what they also saw is that the bug rate went up by 50%. So companies who had development teams that were distributed remote versus who were co-located actually saw an increase of the bug rate of over 50%. So you had this interesting conundrum on the digital leaders really, not having a big of an impact on them. The laggards with low developer velocity got the double whammy on productivity and bugs in their product. and which then ultimately leads to the third finding in the technology bucket, which is security.
Right.
Like that was one of the ones that stood out, like customers with high developer velocity indexes or high developer velocity in general were companies who had made investments in security, who had adopted DevSecOps practices, who had institutionalized the whole notion of leaning left and so forth. But I think from a technology perspective, cloud adoption, the tool set, and then this whole, cultural thinking of security being a part of everyone's day-to-day job were kind of the three things that stood out on the security side. And then working practices and organizational enablement were two other really big pillars.
I'd love to drill more into those, but what I'm kind of hearing is that the technological needs were such a baseline that if you missed out on those, you were screwed. 50% bug rate increase, you're going to be a laggard, you have all these issues. But what did the data say about working practices and organizational enablement, then using those to increase that velocity?
Yeah. So if you start with working practices, I think really three things stood out. One was this whole notion of agile, which again should be pretty obvious, but I think what was underneath it wasn't just about, adopting agile practices. It was actually some of the organizational implications behind that, because adopting agile practices without restructuring your teams is not going to get you very far. Yeah. Exactly. So this whole notion of, companies with high developer velocity have really, broken down their organization, created these small, more autonomous, agile teams that own their product end to end, and then combined with the technology side of loosely coupled architectures and so forth. That was kind of a big driver of high developer velocity, and we can maybe talk about it a little bit later. It's actually one of the first things companies should be looking at if they want to drive high developer velocity. The other thing that we saw was inner sourcing in general was a big driver of it, creating this openness, collaborative environment inside the organization. And then last but definitely not least, I'd say open source adoption. I thought this one was interesting because it's not that open source adoption in itself, gives you high developer velocity. But what we saw was that companies who already had, good developer velocity were able to get to great developer velocity by adopting open source technologies. So those companies that were already in the leader category, so to speak, and that had adopted open source categories were actually able to set themselves further apart, both in terms of innovation and pace of innovation, but also developer satisfaction. Because I think there's this whole notion of open source being a great way to attract and retain developers. It's, companies contributing to open source project is really a great way to show to the world that you're innovative and invested in that areas. Open source kind of in itself was a driver on the working practice side.
That's so interesting. It's clear that there's this compounding effect where if you miss out on one thing, you're going to miss out on the benefits that are compounding from the others. For the leaders who are listening to this talk, what should they do to begin kind of using and integrating some of these learnings into their own organizations?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. So I think around organizational enablement in general, which I think a lot of leaders need to spend a lot of time on in this regard. There were a couple of really key pointers that I think every leader should take to heart. Number one, and again, no surprise, but the importance of world-class talent management and talent development. And it's one of those things like, as a leader, you cannot outsource. Like the value proposition for your company on why top world-class development talent should work for you is something that every leadership team should have on their daily agenda, and so to speak. So really think through, like, what is your value proposition in the market? Do you have the right programs in place to attract and retain talent? Is definitely one category. Making sure you use your top talent on your biggest project. I think obviously a given will obviously help your top projects more successful, but it also helps drive, broader organizational enablement and broader organizational development, and
learning on the job to have happiness too, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly a key thing. Like this whole notion that the individual developer is in most cases more important than the leaders and the executive team in this world is really, really critical. So number one thing to do as a leader is really take talent management to heart. I think the second thing I'd say is this whole notion of agile and really setting your organization up for. It's making sure that you restructure your organization into these smaller, more autonomous teams, making sure that you're working towards a more loosely coupled architecture and so forth. But I think this whole notion of agile and should really be the one of the first three things that every leader should look at. And then the last thing I would say is this whole, something that's near and dear to my heart, is this whole notion of product management as a discipline and building strong product management capabilities. Because if you're moving to a world where you have these autonomous teams that kind of own their product end to end, both, customer facing product, but even internal product, like the whole importance of product management as a discipline and having people who have a strong foundation in business and in technology is super critical. And as we talked about at the beginning, it was actually one of the top 4 drivers of high developer velocity. So yeah, if this was my business, I'd probably start in those 3 areas. And then as you grow in maturity, you can start looking at other things around the tool set and automation and so forth. But those are 3 things that every business leader could start on tomorrow.
Those are great takeaways. And I feel like there's this table stakes now with technology where you have to be cloud adoptive, you have to meet certain standards, and then you have these opportunities for these big moves like you mentioned. But if we drill down a bit into like the individual developer experience, how can they make a broad impact on their team velocity from an individual standpoint?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. I think a couple of things jump to mind. The number one thing is, if you really think about what developer velocity is, the whole idea behind developer velocity is how do you create the right environment and how you remove points of friction for developers so that they can become more innovative. So as an individual developer, it's almost one of the first call to action is speak up. Like if you see inefficiencies in the process, if there's anything in your day-to-day life that's limiting you from being innovative and having high velocity, speak up. Bring solutions to the table. I always say that's usually what really sets people apart. But don't sit by yourself and get frustrated that something isn't running as optimal as it could. Speak up, take it. Work with your colleagues, take it up the management chain, and every leadership that really wants to take developer velocity to heart would listen and address. So I think that's kind of the first thing.
And to your point, I think they have to enable that too, right? Like leaders have to give this space where developers feel not just allowed, but encouraged and maybe even compelled in a polite way to speak up, like you're saying.
Spot on. I mean, again, like we said at the beginning, like culture was one of the other 4 things that really stood out. And this all comes down to it. Do you have that open and transparent culture where people cannot just do the best work, but can also contribute to make others work better and contribute to higher developer velocity across the whole organization? Which then also is probably another thing I would call out on individual contributors is really like this whole notion of enablement. Like, what are you doing to help make others better? Like, are you sharing best practices? We talked a lot about tool set and tool chaining in the beginning. Like, if you found out a different way of doing something, like, are you sharing that with your peers? You found a great way of continue to further your learning. Are you sharing that with your peers? So I really think this whole mindset of not just becoming better as an individual developer yourself, but how can you help your colleagues become developers? Better developers is probably a second category. And then third, because we talked about it in the beginning, security. Like, I think take lean left to heart, and more secure your code is, the more time you're going to free up, not just for yourself, but for the whole organization to focus on innovation. So yeah, I think top of mind, those would probably be the 3 things I'd advise individual developers to take to heart as it pertains to, improving their company's all-up developer velocity.
I think these are really great points. And like you said, when there's this baseline tooling and good hiring practices and good culture in place, you can then kind of take those next steps of how do I help my developers have ownership of their code? How do I really enable them to be able to fully embrace agile practices, which means you have to have them throughout the organization? How do we make sure they have an opportunity to speak up and do all these things that are going to really take what we're doing at the next level? This has been super interesting. And I know there's some great takeaways here. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. What are the best places to dig deeper into this research?
Take a look at it. All the research papers are on the website. So azure.com/developer velocity. All the research paper we did with McKinsey is there, as well as some best practices on how to get started.
Fantastic. We'll definitely drop a link in the chat right now. And thanks so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful honor.
Thank you, Connor. It's been an absolute pleasure.